Shalom, brothers and sisters. So, chaos reigned over the last week plus, but specifically the last week in Syria. Now, Syria is a very important nation besides Isaiah 17 and the prophecy over Damascus. The fact that it sits squarely against Israel and multiple enemies of Israel are entrenched in Syria, Turkey, Russia, Iran, all these countries. And we know the Gog-Magog war, this is the perfect staging ground for them to gather their forces and come against Israel hard. So Syria has always been right squarely in front of us as something we need to be watching. So a lot of you have been watching the developments now right up to the point where Assad's regime was toppled, which was historic. But a lot of you might not understand where everything started. So I'm going to run you through just the basic points here as to where this all comes from and why it's such a historic moment. The whole story of this conflict in Syria begins with pro-democracy protests that erupted in March 2011. That's a long time ago. People rose up for democracy and protested. A bunch of teenagers painted revolutionary slogans on a school wall. Security forces were sent out by Assad to deal with the demonstrators, eventually opening fire and killing several of them. And then from there, everything unraveled. The unrest triggered nationwide protests demanding Assad's resignation. We all know that never happened. The government's use of force to crush this dissent just hardened the protesters' resolve. By June, July 2011, hundreds of thousands were taking to the streets across the country. Now, you would think at this stage that he would see the writing on the wall, literally, and he would resign and leave because he had spurred on the aggression against them and the pushback. But that is not what happened because people like Russia propped him up with support. Opposition supporters eventually began to take up arms, first to defend themselves, later to expel security forces from local areas. Violence escalated. The country descended into civil war as rebel brigades were formed to battle government forces for control of cities, towns, countrysides. Fighting reached the capital of Damascus and second city of Aleppo in 2012. The conflict in 2013, the UN said 90,000 people had been killed external in the conflict. By August 2015, the figure had climbed to 250,000 people dead, according to activists and the United Nations. The conflict is now more than just a battle for those against Assad and those for Assad. It has gone into overtones, pitching the country's Sunni majority, one type of Muslim group, against the president's Shia Alawite sect and drawn in regional and world powers into Syria. The rise of the jihadist group Islamic State, IS, further added another dimension, and they want an Islamic caliphate in Syria and Iraq. So all these things now spiraling out of control completely with all the different groups. The UN Commission of Inquiries External has evidence that all parties, every single party involved in this conflict, have committed war crimes, including murder, torture, rape, enforced disappearances. They've been accused of using civilian suffering, such as blocking access to food, water, and health services, and sieges as means of waging this war in the country. More than 4.5 million people have fled Syria since the start of the conflict. Most of them women and children. Neighboring Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey struggled to cope with the largest refugee exoduses in recent history. 10% of Syrian refugees sought safety in Europe, sowing political divisions as countries argue over who shares the burden for what's happening in Syria. A further 6.5 million people were internally displaced inside Syria. 1.2 million were driven from their homes in 2015 alone. December 2024, come full circle back to right now and what's happening historically. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad boards a plane and leaves Damascus for an unknown destination on Sunday, I would assume Russia. The plane disappears while in the air above Homs so possibly shot down. There was some erratic flying apparently, and suddenly the plane disappears off radar. Now, when a radar contact of an aircraft disappears, it's very possible, when you look at the situation and the war and the rebels and the weapons and everything going on, that it has been shot down and destroyed. So we don't have a definite on that yet, but I would lean very heavily towards the Syrians shot him down and he's dead. Meanwhile, rebel forces in Damascus declared the capital city free of longtime ruler Bashar al-Assad as government forces withdraw completely. After 54 years, the Assad regime has fallen. Now, this impacts various players. Russia has bases and people inside Syria, Turkey, the USA, Israel, Iran, all of them directly affected by what's currently happening in Syria. So again, historic, absolutely, Damascus being at the center of all of this. The problem now is a lot of things are left behind that are quite dangerous to other countries. So the IDF took over the Syrian Hermon, Mount Hermon, which bridges the two countries. They've taken over the Syrian side. The IDF on Sunday overtook the Syrian side of Mount Hermon mountain range to expand a demilitarized buffer zone along the border with Syria, and also at several other points of significance for defense. The Hermon range has been thought of as a strategic advantage because it provides high ground for the entire area, enabling Israel to anticipate any potential invading force. The military added it would not get involved in any internal occurrences in Syria, provided that no forces in Syria endanger Israeli security interests. They also immediately struck the Syrian chemical weapons factory. Now, in this whole conflict, and I never touched on that, Syria actually used chemical weapons at one stage in that conflict on their own people. So horrifying. And Israel has now taken that out because the last thing they need is a chemical weapons attack on them from unstable Islamic militant groups that are now running around in Syria post the Assad regime. Then US and Israel conduct dozens of strikes and hit over 75 targets in the wake of Syria's regime collapse. So as they saw the writing on the wall and Syria's regime was completely collapsing, they went in masse, Israel and America, and they struck multiple bases, more than 75. CENTCOM announced it hit 75 known Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham ISIS camps and operatives in central Syria. They added it struck the targets to disrupt, degrade, and defeat ISIS and render it incapable of exploiting the nation's current state to regroup in central Syria. Israel, again, if you went through the further news, went and attacked and took out all fighter planes and military equipment that they could find, so that these things don't fall into the wrong hands and can be used against them. So they went for strategic military targets that would affect Israel in the long run should a conflict spring up between them and who's in charge now. And speaking of who's in charge now, the person there, Syrian rebel commander, said, "We respect Israel and Trump. We look to Israel and the US with the arrival of President Donald Trump, and we have a lot of respect and sympathy for them, for their actions against Iran, the country that leads terrorism in the region and all over the world." So again, sounds amazing, sounds promising, sounds like they might not be a threat, but Israel, very shrewd and very capable, is watching very closely, and not just watching, but making sure that certain things are not available to this new group in case they decide to sway against Israel. So no chemical weapons, no advanced weaponry, fighter planes are off the table, all these things are removed in case you decide that, you know what, we actually do want to hurt Israel and America like the rest of our brethren across the Middle East. So Damascus still stands now. They are an unstable, unknown quantity. Could they still have other chemical weapons? Could they have other weapons we don't know about that are stored beneath Damascus? Could it be necessary for them to threaten Israel to the point that Israel uses their Samson option and nukes Damascus to make a point? We don't know. Could it be that someone strikes Damascus and one of those hordes or weapon caches of weapons that we don't know what's down there goes off and levels Damascus once and for all, turning it into a ruinous heap? All these things are possibilities currently lying right in front of us. And we watch closely because prophecy is literally unfolding in front of us. Now, with all of that laid out and you understanding where it started all the way to now, where we're at now, please pray for the Syrian civilians in this entire chaotic situation. Lives that have been destroyed, families that have been split up, disruptions, chaos. Pray for them that they will find the Lord Jesus Christ, that their lives can come back together, that they can have a sense of normalcy for once in their lives, and that this could actually be something that could take them back to living instead of running in fear constantly. Pray for these people always. God bless. Keep looking up. Shalom.